Hey, welcome back. Today I made Peeps, but there's weed in it. I'm really excited about this one. I feel like we were overdue for a cool one, so hopefully this counts. I also want to quickly shout out Emma's Goodies, who inspired this recipe. She put out a 5-minute marshmallow video a couple months ago, and I was like, weed peeps, duh. So thank you to her. I'm going to link her in the description if you haven't checked her out already. And I also want to give a little disclaimer before we start. They're kind of hard to make them look like Peeps. My first several rounds came out as just blobs of marshmallow. So if you don't care, just go ahead, skip this part. If you really want them to look like Peeps, I would recommend doing a dry run first. So just do all the same stuff but leave out your weed oil, just until you get the shape down. And then when you feel like you've got it, do a weed batch. The whole marshmallow part, from beginning of marshmallow to end of peep, takes like 15 minutes. So you're not going to spend a lot of time doing it, but it might save you some, unpleasant looking weed peeps if you just do a dry run first. So that is all I have to say, and now I'm going to show you how I made 15 to 20 peeps with about 40 milligrams each. I am going to use wax in this recipe. Firstly, because the flavor of wax is a lot less noticeable than the flavor of bud, but also because I will be infusing such a small amount of oil. Only 1.5 teaspoons of coconut oil goes into this recipe, so if I wanted the same potency, I'd have to use kind of a lot of bud, which would be very hard to infuse into my small amount of oil. So I recommend using wax if you have access to that. To start, I'm putting my wax onto a baking sheet, and I will decarb this at 240 degrees Fahrenheit for about 35 minutes. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about dosing. So we know that 1 gram equals 1,000 milligrams. So 1 gram of wax is 1,000 milligrams of wax, and we just need to figure out how much of that is THC. So your package will say the percent THC of your wax. So we'll just do 1,000 times your percent THC divided by the number of peeps we end up with. So for example, if I had an 80% THC wax, I would do 1,000 times 80% gives me 800 milligrams total. Divide that by, say, 20 peeps, if that's how many we come out with. That would give me 40 milligrams in each of my peeps. When my wax is finished decarbing, I will need to remove it from the container. So I have my nonstick mat. You can also use parchment paper, and while it is still warm, I'm just dumping out the wax onto that nonstick mat. And then I'm going to take this whole thing and put it into the fridge so that that wax will stiffen up a little bit. While I wait on that, I'm going to make my colored sugar for the outside of my peeps. So I'm taking 3/4 of a cup of white sugar and putting it into a food cutter or a food processor, and then I'm just using the drops of food coloring. You can also use food coloring gel if you prefer. I'm just doing a couple drops of that, and then I'm going to pulse this in my food processor until all of it is colored. I added a little bit more. I think I ended up with 12 drops total until I got to this nice yellow color that I was happy with, but feel free to go darker or lighter to your preference. When our wax has stiffened up, I just pull the container off and all of my wax is on this nonstick mat. So I'm just going to use the mat or parchment paper to stick it to itself. And once it's all grouped together, I will grab a fork and stick the whole thing to this fork so that I can easily infuse it into my oil when I'm ready. Next, I prepared a double boiler. I'm using an insert, but you can just use a glass measuring cup or a glass bowl as well. And I have my 1.5 teaspoons of coconut oil in here. Once that has melted down, I'll start stirring with my fork that has the wax on it until all of that wax has melted into my oil and is no longer on the fork. It is a very quick infusing process, so when that is finished, I'm just pouring this back into the bowl that my oil was in before, and I'll just leave that to the side until we are ready for it. Now I'll start my marshmallows. So I'm taking 1 packet of gelatin and 1/4 of a cup of water, and I'll mix those together and then just leave that to the side so my gelatin can bloom. Next, in a saucepan, I'm adding 2 tablespoons of corn syrup, 2 tablespoons of water, and 1/2 of a cup of white sugar. I will give that a quick stir and then put it on a medium-low heat. While it is heating up, don't stir it. Just let it sit until it reaches about 240 degrees Fahrenheit. By now, my gelatin has had time to bloom, so I put it onto the stand mixer and I started that on a low speed, and I will just pour my sugar mixture in very slowly so that it doesn't splash around or splash you with that hot sugar. Once you have it all in, you can turn the speed on your mixer up a little bit. I would say medium high to high, maybe not the maximum speed, but like one below it. And we're basically just going to whip this until we get our marshmallow consistency. I wanted to show you a long time of it looking like this because it's going to look like this for a while and then suddenly it will look like marshmallow fluff. So don't be discouraged, it will get there. As this thickens up, I will add in my infused oil, and I'm also adding a half of a teaspoon of vanilla extract, and you can add other flavorings and colors at this point as well. I am scraping down the side of my bowl to ensure that all of my infused oil is in the marshmallows and not on the side of my mixing bowl. And then we will just turn this back on and continue mixing it until we get to our desired consistency. We want our mixture to be stiff enough to hold the shape of our peeps, and I learned from Ashley Marie's homemade peeps video, which I will link in the description, that it should hold its shape for 8 seconds, and that's how you know it's ready to go. So I just watched it fall, and if it could hold its shape for 8 seconds, it's ready, and then I move it into a piping bag, and we will have to work pretty quickly from here on because you have to do everything else before the marshmallows set. I will quickly put down a layer of my colored sugar into a small baking dish or a pan that has sides, and then I'm going to start piping my peeps. I am starting off with their bodies, and I decided to put mine together so that you can tear them apart like normal peeps, and I did it in 5 since that's how they typically come, I think. So just piping little ovals of marshmallow together until you've used about 2/3 of your marshmallow fluff. Then I started to do their heads, but I could tell after the first one that it was still a little bit too warm. So I'll just wait a couple of minutes so that my mixture can stiffen up a tiny bit and it will be able to hold that shape a little bit better. And then as you can see, it's kind of a back and then forward type of motion to make their little heads. And then you just kind of spin it off so that they have little beaks. And I don't know if I explained that well, but hopefully you can see what I'm doing enough to kind of mimic it. And this is where making a practice round will definitely come in handy because, like I said, my first ones came out as just blobs of marshmallows. I started by making 19 bodies because I wasn't sure if I would have enough, but then I could tell at the end that I did have enough for one more peep, so I rounded it off with 20 peeps. Then I sprinkled the rest of my colored sugar on top, and as you can see, it kind of misses the sides of them, so I ended up picking them up and just pressing them into the colored sugar so that all of the white marshmallow would be covered in that colored sugar. Here they are all covered, and you can see my 2 rows at the back were a little bit cooler when I piped them, so they held their shape a little better, but even my blobby guys at the front are going to look more peep-like once we add their eyeballs. So I took a couple of chocolate chips, just enough to cover the bottom of a mixing cup, and microwaved that for 30 to 45 seconds until they were soft. And then I'm just going to take a toothpick and start dabbing the eyeballs on, and you can see even my blob guys at the front look a lot better once you put their eyeballs on. Here they are all ready to go. Again, you can see my guys at the front that were a little bit warmer when I piped them are a little bit wider, and then the ones at the back that were cooler when I piped them have retained their shape really well. I also made a batch with weed sprinkles on them, mostly just for picture purposes and for the thumbnail, so feel free to add a little weed leaf if you want to. And finally, I thought we would do a comparison with store-bought Peeps. I had actually never had a Peep before I set out to make these, so I was very excited to try a store-bought Peep as well. My first thing I noticed was the store-bought ones are a little bit stiffer, but I will say the longer you keep these homemade ones, the more stiff they get, so it might just have to do with, being on a shelf for a while. But here you can see a little cross section, and I think, just kind of cool to see how they look and how they turned out. I ended up liking the taste of the homemade one better, which is maybe not surprising. But yeah, I hope you enjoy. I was very excited with how these turned out, and I would love to know what you think of them in the comments. Like I said, these should be about 40 milligrams each, but with homemade edibles it is hard to tell, so just eat half if you need to, and keep in mind it can take 2 to 3 hours for edibles to fully kick in. If you try making these at home, I would love to see pictures. You can find me on Instagram, and as always, thank y'all so much for watching.